Vince Stevenson, speaks of Bromley, and my speech is entitled School Days. Stevenson, you leave here with no qualifications, but you'll probably do very well, said Mr. McSweeney, my headmaster. How wrong he was. School days evokes great memories. They say that school days should be the best time of your life, and for me that was true. It was a wonderful experience, especially secondary school, where I made so many friends and we did so many things. I'm going to tell you about a few of those things today. I'm going to tell you about some of my teachers. I'm going to tell you about some of my studies. And I'm going to tell you about some of my activities, especially football. I'm going to start with Mr. McManus, he was rather an uptight maths teacher, and he was quite rough really, he was quite tough, and he'd say, Stevenson, if you can't improve on the silence, then shut up. But he was a great guy at heart. He was incredibly well versed in mathematics, always helpful, always had lots of time for his students, and he would stay after school to help, and not many people in those days would ever have entertained that. Then we had Mr. McSweeney, the headmaster. What an interesting guy he was. He had the most enormous Ford console, and every week one of the sixth formers would be invited to clean it inside and out, just for the privilege of helping the headmaster. What a great guy. I don't think you could do that these days. I think Bob a Job is out. And finally, there was my favourite teacher of all time, Miss Sykes, my French mistress. She was sensational. I fell in love with Miss Sykes the first time I met her, and I was so happy that she was my French teacher and my form teacher. She was 21, this was her first job, and I was just 11, and I didn't think that the age gap mattered that much. But she did. But that's life. Studies, as I mentioned, not a great student in those days, but I really loved my French for obvious reasons. Then I got on to Spanish, and I certainly loved art. And towards the end of my school career there, I was taking up a very unusual interest, a weird interest in this thing called computers that very few people had heard of. Well, they'd heard about them, but they didn't actually understand them back in the late 70s. So that was a great moment for me. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we did as children. I loved football. I dreamed football. It pervaded my very presence. Everything I did revolved around football. Training and playing. Training and playing. And if it wasn't for football, I suspect that I would never have found this wanderlust for travel, because where I lived in Manchester, it was a bit like Albert Square. Nobody actually left the square. But for me, as a 15-year-old, to go to Canada and pay for the trip myself by going and getting a job, this was fantastic. My mother and father, in their 30s and 40s, had never left the shores of Britain. So for me to go to Canada for 3 weeks without them, this was quite an amazing achievement. And from there, we travelled all over Ontario. Niagara Falls, could you imagine Niagara Falls? Possibly the most romantic city, the most romantic place I've ever been. And when you see the falls late into the night with all the colours of the rainbow, massive lights shining down onto the falls, it's unbelievable. It's so evocative, and it just reminds me of why I loved my childhood and why I loved school so much. But since then, and after the first Canadian trip, I went to France and played football in the Loire Valley against the French. And they have a funny word for offside, and I can't remember what it is. But we, being from Manchester, we didn't actually shout offside. We thought that was cheating. But they seemed to have their hands up and shouting offside in French rather a lot. And then on to Spain, through the Pyrenees, playing football in Spain. I remember playing in the snow in the Pyrenees. Absolutely sensational. Great days, great times. I wish they'd come back.